Good morning. My name is Mel Hartley, and I am the Senior Communications and Regulation Officer here at the Training Accreditation Council, and would like to welcome you to this workshop, Continuous Improvement. This is a new workshop, and it forms part of the Training Accreditation Council's education program. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. And now I'd like to introduce Russell, who is our presenter for today. And Russell's been an auditor at TAC for quite a number of years and is well acquainted with the standards. Over to you, Russell.
Thank you very, very much, Mel, and thank you, Mel, for putting this all together. It's a tribute to TAC the way it organises this education program. The topics for our workshop today are firstly to look at the rationale behind continuous improvement and to reflect upon why continuous improvement is needed. That's, of course, driven in part by the fact that there is a requirement for continuous improvement in the standards themselves, and so we'll look briefly at that. And then we need to look at the continuous improvement process, starting from what are the kinds of inputs to continuous improvement, what sort of outputs might come from continuous improvement, strategies for continuous improvement, and the ways in which we can merge the continuous improvement process into the day-to-day operations of our RTO, and then looking at continually improving continuous improvement. In other words, our continuous improvement process itself is something that needs to be monitored in order to make sure that it is working effectively. But before we get into what the standards say, we just need to reflect on the fact that the changes can occur abruptly. I'm calling that quantum change because it's, if you like, a kind of quantum leap, and changes could occur incrementally. And there is a place for both, but what we are looking at today is the concept of incremental change. Quantum change is a kind of revolutionary change, an abrupt change, which might involve a very large leap. It might involve, and probably would involve, new processes and products. It involves discarding the past experience, and for that reason, it can be very challenging to staff. Incremental change, on the other hand, is gentler. It involves a kind of evolutionary process. There are small steps that build on past experience and past activities. So you're not creating new processes or products, you're revising processes or products. So because there's that sense of adjustment from the familiar rather than abandonment of the familiar, it is respectful of staff and their feelings and concerns. But before we move on to the next slide, I just want to say that there are really two drivers for change. One is that you've identified that you are not meeting the standards yourselves and that you need to make changes. Those standards could be the formal standards for RTOs, or they could be your own in-house standards. But for whatever reason, you recognise that what you're doing isn't what you want to achieve. But the other possibility is that you are doing what you want to achieve and you are meeting the current standards, but the standards change. In other words, what will happen is that the goalposts move and you need to adjust your game in order to accommodate that. So change can be sometimes driven from a need for you to improve, or it could be that you need to shift with what's happening outside the organisation. So when we look at the rationale for continuous improvement, we can see that as an RTO, you're ultimately responsible for ensuring that the training you deliver and the assessment that you conduct are quality processes within your organisation. And it goes beyond just the training and assessment, because it includes all aspects of your RTO's operation. So it could include how you market your products, how you administer your programs, how you certificate the graduates, how you employ staff, how you manage staff. In other words, continuous improvement goes beyond just that interface with the students and the learners, but to the whole operations of the organisation. And you need to be able to evaluate information about performance and use that information to inform quality assurance of services. So it's very much about being evidence-based, and we at VET are very much about it being evidence-based. And so when we look a bit later on at inputs, you'll see that what we're looking at is sources of evidence. And that can be evidence of change outside the organisation to which you need to adapt, or evidence of performance within the organisation, which I might say might show that you're doing a good job. That's good evidence to get, evidence that you're succeeding. Or it might show that there's room for improvement, in which case the evidence is giving you information about opportunities for continuous improvement. But the information you use needs to be relevant to the way in which you work as an RTO. So we don't expect to find that RTOs have a kind of standardised continuous improvement process across different RTOs. Even within a large complex RTO, continuous improvement processes might be different because the processes must reflect the way in which the organisations work. And so we don't have, from an attack perspective, a position that says this is what a continuous improvement process must look like. So when we get to the standards for continuous improvement, they don't talk about how you maintain quality, but rather what are the kinds of parameters that need to operate so that you, within your context and within your organisation, can maintain quality. Now, it does make some fairly strong statements, though, in Standard 2.1, because Standard 2, of course, relates to the operations of the RTO and quality assured. In 2.1, it basically says that you must comply with the standards. It's a kind of a bootstrapping thing when it says there's a standard here which says that you must comply with itself and the other standards. But note it says, including where services are being delivered on its behalf. So if you are using third-party providers, then you must make sure that those providers operate in a way which sustains the quality of delivery of services, and that means that you have a quality assurance process that extends beyond the RTO to its third parties. And although we don't show it on the slide, 2.3 says that there has to be a written agreement with third parties. And 2.4 says that written agreement must include strategies to monitor the quality of third-party provisions. So it is important that we understand, and that you understand, that quality is in part managed by yourselves, in part managed by TAC in terms of auditing and quality assurance through those processes, and partly it involves you auditing if you like TAC does, the quality of services being delivered on your behalf. And then it goes on to 2.2 and it becomes a little bit more prescriptive, because what it's basically saying is here that you need to be systematic in your processes. It's not saying what those processes must be, but they need to be systematic, which means that there's a sense in which there is a recognisable continuous improvement process. And that basically is driven by information, which means it's evidence-based, which includes, but is not limited to, quality performance indicator data collected under clause 7.5. You need to refer to 7.5, we'll touch on that in a second, but also other information such as validation outcomes, client, trainer, and assessor feedback, and complaints and appeals. So what it's trying to do is to say that the systematic process that you have is one that draws upon the whole range of inputs. So let's look at those inputs, and we'll just briefly touch on these because it's fairly self-evident. But first of all, clause 7.5, and I'll bring this up directly because a lot of people don't recognise that information that they provide to the NCBR provides you with information which you can then access yourselves to look at changes in the way in which the organisation is working and changes or indicators of effectiveness as an organisation. So student outcome surveys, surveys in employee use and views, apprentice and the traineeship trainee destination surveys, and RTO level completions data. Now, fundamentally, that information is there for kind of mass monitoring of the way in which the VET system is working. But at an individual level, as an individual RTO, you can access information that will help you to identify how your organisation is going within that context. But there are more direct and immediate forms of information you can gather. So, for example, with student feedback, you can get student feedback at the end of each session. Indeed, we'll be asking you for feedback on this workshop itself because we want to continuously improve this workshop. So there's immediate feedback, and then there's, if you like, delayed feedback, where it might be at the end of a period of time, like a semester or a year. You might get a feedback, and of course there is graduate feedback. So students who have graduated are now in the workplace can provide you with meaningful information about how well the organisation prepared them for that workplace. Trainers and assessors can provide feedback because they are immersed in the system that would hopefully be conscious of student concerns and student reactions, but also as qualified and competent people themselves, they can be both critical and self-critical of their own work, but also critical and analytical about the work of the RTO. Complaints and appeals, although these are rarely evident these days, nonetheless they do happen, and when a complaint occurs, it could be because there was a misunderstanding about what the RTO required, or it could be that the RTO has gone off the track, in which case complaints can provide you and appeals can provide you with very meaningful information for your continuous improvement process. Employer feedback too, because employers may be engaged with you as you are delivering, so there could be work placements, there could be apprenticeships and traineeships, and there may be all sorts of ways in which employers engage with you during the delivery process. So you can get feedback from employers about the effectiveness of the services you're offering, including learner support services, because they would be conscious of that as well. And of course, employers of your graduates can also provide feedback. Assessment validation, which is picked up in clauses 1.9 through to 1.11, also provide you with information now quite specifically about the design and construction of assessment strategies and tools, but also the delivery of the tools by assessors or observers, and then the judgments made by assessors. All of that becomes part of input to continuous improvement. Industry engagement can also provide you with continuous improvement. So talking to industry about your graduates, getting industry to look at the resources you're using, equipment that you're using, but also you just looking at industry and identifying to what extent what you do on campus reflects and is consistent with what is happening in industry. It can lead to continuous improvement. Community feedback as well, because many TAFEs are woven into the fabric of the community. Many RTOs are directly connected to workplaces and to communities. And so under those circumstances, community feedback about the effectiveness of the RTO in supporting the community can be very meaningful. And of course, there are the two traditional approaches, which is internal audits against some or all of the standards, and external audits, in this particular case, TAC. But if you're with ASQA, and I know in many cases people who attend these workshops it would be ASQA or the Victorian Regulatory Authority. So that fundamentally you can see that there are lots of ways of getting information that will either stimulate a continuous improvement or give you reassurance that what you're doing is working well. And that is of itself valuable. When it comes to outputs, there are, if you like, three clumps of outputs that one might consider. And so, for example, if you look at policies and procedures, training strategies and content, assessment strategies and content, and marketing and RTO information, those might be things that you need to revise and rewrite. These are fundamentally documents, and what you'll be looking at there is, do I need to change any of these in order to improve the work of our RTO? In the case of industry engagement, certification, RTO resources, trainers and assessors, and quality assurance, it may be that you have to focus there on managing those processes. So how do you manage industry engagement? And how do you document or record the outcomes of it? How do you manage certification? How do you manage RTO resources? How do you manage trainers and assessors? How do you structure and manage quality assurance? So those will probably be documented in the forms of policies and procedures. But here what we're really talking about is things where you need to change how things work, how you do things, rather than the sort of infrastructure in that first collection. And finally, there's a kind of day-to-day active stuff, that is, the support you're giving on a day-to-day basis to learners and the training and assessment experiences that learners are having. Those are sorts of things which you are delivering on a day-by-day basis. And so you might need to change those. And again, they might be backed up by policies and procedures. And they always involve corporate management. But what we're talking about here is the day-to-day experience, if you like, of learners. And you may need to change those day-to-day experiences. So they could be outputs from continuous improvement. The word continuous improvement, though, is not only refers to the fact that it's a kind of incremental process, but also a cyclic process. And so this wheel, if you like, illustrates that kind of cycle. And we're going to just take you through a sort of an illustrative exemplar for this. But if you start with box number 1 or arrow number 1, gather evidence and identify issues from inputs, that leads on to identifying standards expected of and by the RTO, which could be standards external to the RTO or standards that the RTO has set itself. You then, when you say, well, I've identified an issue, I've looked at the relevant standards, then you identify potential causes of the issue. So you start asking yourself, well, why are we going astray? How have we gone off script in relation to this? You then identify potential remedies to address those causes, and you would then prioritise or select from the remedies, then implement the selected remedy or remedies, and then you go back and review the impact, which then involves gathering more evidence and so on. So we have a cycle, and we can illustrate that over the next slides. And I might say that one of the handouts that you've been given, apart from these slides themselves, this sequence of steps is also illustrated on pages 6 and 7 of the handout that you've been given. So if we start with step 1, where we're gathering evidence and identifying issues for inputs. I want you to imagine that the student feedback that has been provided by current and graduate students report that they don't have enough time to learn and under too much pressure to meet assessment deadlines. So what they're saying is we are cracking under the strain of the workload that you've provided. So what's the problem here? And so you could start off by saying, well, do the standards have anything to say about that? And it could either be your own in-house standards in terms of the kind of pastoral care you provide for students, or they could be the standards for RTOs. And if you look at the standards for RTOs in step 2, you can see that there's a lot that talks about those sorts of issues. For example, standard 1.1 talks about providing sufficient and appropriate resources to enable a student to achieve their outcomes, their wanted outcomes. Standard 1.2 talks about making sure that there is a sufficient amount of training for a student to achieve their outcomes. It doesn't talk about not having too much training, But what it is saying is you need to be conscious of the amount of training. Then there's support, learner support, which I stand at 1.7, which talks about providing educational and support services to learners. And so maybe part of the problem is that we're not providing sufficient or adequate support. Then there's assessment fairness under 1.8. Perhaps there's a problem in terms of the assessment demands that we're making, and perhaps we're being unfair in terms of our assessment demands. It may be that it's going to be inevitably heavy, but we didn't tell students up front that this was a heavy and demanding course. So maybe the problem is the information we provide them with, which is standard 5.1. And also there are learner obligations which relate to the students meeting the requirements of the training and the like, standard 5.2. So you can see that there are a lot of standards that touch on this issue. So if we go to step 3, we start saying, well, what could be the problem? And it may be that they have unreasonable expectations about the time demands of the course. Maybe we gave them the impression this was going to be easy, even though it's inevitably going to be hard. Or maybe there's a duplication of knowledge and skills across related units, and we're actually asking them to do more work than they need. Or maybe we haven't synchronised our assessments to make sure that there are not multiple assessments due on the same date. Or maybe that we haven't been conscious of the fact that there are stresses within and outside the course, such as, COVID introduced stresses. Those sorts of things might be causing the problem we're looking at. So at step 4, we start thinking about solutions. And what we start thinking about is, well, maybe we can reduce the course intensity by clustering units of competency to avoid duplication. Maybe we need to make sure up front that there's advice about the intensity of the course. Maybe we need to coordinate assessment deadlines, and maybe we need to make sure that there are adequate support services for students experiencing elevated stress levels. So we then either do all this or we choose from that list, but we need to recognise that when it comes to clustering and assessment coordination, we can't do that straight away. It'll be the responsibility of trainers and assessors, but we can't expect that to happen until the next time the course is delivered. Maybe we will revise the course brochure. Well, it's too late now. The course has already been marketed, but the next time we market it, maybe we'll make clear to them how heavy a load it is and that they need to set enough time. That's part of the role of the amount of training is to in effect say to students, we need this much of your brain to be committed to this course. And that's very much about being open and upfront at the beginning. Or maybe the student services need to set up a stress support program, and that we could do immediately. We could offer that service tomorrow for the students. So there are some things which will be delayed, some things which will be done immediately, some things done by trainers and assessors, some things done by administrative action. And so you can see that there'll be different kinds of remedies. And then we take a final step, which is to review what we've done. So we go back to student feedback and to any other kind of source of information. And we basically ask through student surveys, how's it going? Well, that illustrates for you how those 6 steps integrate. But we also need to think about how you integrate what you're doing with the day-to-day work of the RTO. So first of all, you need to, in a sense, say to each of your team members in the RTO, this is part of your everyday work. If you like, it's a sort of thing that could be written into the job description itself. But what they need to become comfortable with is gathering data, administering feedbacks, listening to the students, recording, at least if not necessarily openly, at least reflecting on evidence that they're providing through their comments. So that information can be collated and you get a sense of a trend, a general feeling, if you like. Sharing that with other staff to find out if the issue is just with you or across the board. It may be that there's special cases, in which case there's an individual who might need support, or it might be a trend. In other words, it might be a whole cohort. And then prioritising issues. You can't do all things all the time. You may have to prioritise. then brainstorm solutions, take responsibility for both the cause, because it may be something you need to do yourself, but also taking responsibility for action to deal with it, and monitoring progress and evaluating outcomes. It's a frame of mind thing. And so when we think about that as a frame of mind thing, we move on to how we weave this all together. It's a mindset, it's an ethos, it's a culture. It's a kind of cliches, I know, but what we're trying to say here is that you don't want to think of continuous improvement as some sort of external process. It needs to be woven into the fabric, if you like, of the way you work as an RTO. And there is within that a certain threat, because to be willing to be involved in continuous improvement is saying we and I can improve. And that means we and I are not really doing as well as we might. So we need to be comfortable about engaging with the continuous improvement process. We need to encourage critical reflection and be tolerant of adverse feedback. So if you provide feedback in relation to this workshop that is not exactly what I want to hear, I learn from that and I'm comfortable with that. In fact, I welcome it. So a flood of emails coming straight away. Responsiveness to adverse feedback, which is that you basically say, well, I will act on it. I won't just defend, but what I'll do is change. Support and encourage others, because others will feel challenged and threatened, and so you need to be part of that process of encouraging them to be committed to change and acceptance of change, but focus always to evidence-based action. We are always evidence, not about opinion, it's about evidence, and our responses should be evidence-based, and our analysis of the outcomes should continue to be evidence-based. And then when we have taken action, we need to be open to the critique of action. We need to be able to say, well, we got that wrong or we got that right. We need to be aware of the fact that improvement itself is a process that needs to be continuously improved. So then we've taken our time and we come now to references to resources. And you have a handout which you've been provided with, and that really does discuss many of the issues that we've touched on today in this very brief webinar. But it's almost always going to be the case that aspects for improvement are going to be related to various aspects of your work as an RTO and compliance with the standards. And TAC, apart from this education program, which is very extensive these days, also has an extensive range of fact sheets. And this is really just a subset of them, because many of the areas where there might be issues will be touched on by a fact sheet. So I urge you to go to the TAC website and look up fact sheets, because there you will find, I think, about 30 of them. I can't remember, I've lost count, covering almost every aspect of the standards and almost every aspect of an RTO's activity. Where we don't have standards and where we are limited in guidance is when it comes to the management and administration of yourself as an RTO, the way you work as a business, if you like. And that is not something which the standards are very vocal about. So there are other areas in which you might need to change, where you might need to improve, and those are not areas in which TAC or the standards express a view or provide advice. But you can get advice, of course, from the web in other ways. But of course, finally, you can contact TAC. And TAC is a repository of all sorts of wisdom. So if you have issues that relate to continuous improvement, please feel free to contact TAC. Now, that might be something about which you're a little nervous, because TAC is the regulatory authority. But TAC, unlike a lot of other regulatory authorities, is an organisation committed to quality improvement and assurance, and so they welcome you sharing your questions and providing you with support and advice. So you can use this screen to guide you to the right source of support. Thank you very much for participating. lovely to have you with us today, and all the best for the future with your continuous improvement processes.